Some of the most common questions I get on stream and in my guides are when to build what item on your support champion of choice. While it can vary from champ to champ, there are some general rules you can follow to know when building what item is the right call. Let's start simple with your starting items as support. When you have a champ that has AP scaling in some fashion, you're either going to take Relic Shield or Spellthiefs. You should take Spellthiefs almost 100% of the time on champions that can easily poke or have longer range abilities like Brand, Xerath, or Vel'Koz. When we're talking about enchanter champions like Janna or Lulu, you could realistically go either way. In lanes that you're going to need a bit more survivability, Relic Shield should typically be your go-to. Think about going against something like a Blitzcrank or Pantheon as Janna. You don't want to overextend while trying to get Spellthief stacks and put yourself in danger by allowing them to engage on you, so Relic Shield can still let you earn money while staying safe. The same mindset applies against champions that outrange you when you're playing an enchanter. Let's imagine you're playing Lulu against a Xerath. You're more than likely not going to be able to get in range of him to land your abilities without taking heavy punishment, so once again, Relic Shield can be a stronger choice. If you're not against a champion that heavily outranges you or someone who can hook you in, you more than likely can go ahead and take Spellthief's Edge since you'll be at much lower risk. That same mindset you have with enchanters should also apply to attack damage supports. If you have an attack damage support that is good at harassing from afar, think champions like Senna or Ashe, you should be pretty much always getting Spectral Sickle. For melee AD supports like Pyke or Pantheon, the majority of the time you'll want to simply go Steel Shouldguards because you're going to get in the middle of fights and therefore be taking damage that will be unavoidable. But against lanes that are a bit safer, like against enchanter champions, you could go Spectral Sickle, it's just a lot less common. With tank supports, there's a little bit more of a preference choice here. Most tank supports have some sort of AP scaling on their abilities, so most would assume that you should buy Relic Shield since it gives a small amount of AP. Obviously, if your champion doesn't have any early AP scaling like Ornn support, you don't have a choice, you should just build Steel Shouldguards. But for other tank supports like Blitzcrank, Leona, or Nautilus, you could really choose either Relic Shield or Steel Shouldguards. With Relic Shield, you get a small AP bonus for each of your abilities, but with Steel Shouldguards, you get more sustained damage over time with your auto attacks. Personally, I prefer Steel Shouldguards on many of these champions, but if you don't envision yourself fighting much in lane with them, then Relic Shield can work just fine. Boots on poke or artillery support should pretty much always be Sorc shoes. Maybe in some situations you could build Boots of Lucidity if you have an important ultimate or are playing more of an enchanter style of poke support like Lux, but 90% of the time Sorc shoes are your go-to. Boots on enchanter champions are almost always going to be Boots of Lucidity. Enchanter champions' support abilities are typically on a longer cooldown, and since you won't be doing damage or be in the middle of fights, these cheap boots should almost always be your go-to. There may be a small argument to make that more aggressive enchanters like Morgana or Karma could go Sorc shoes as well, but that should only be in cases where you're stomping lane. Attack damage support boot choices vary the most because what they do differs so heavily. Ashe's kit is heavily revolved around her arrow as support, so building Boots of Lucidity is the way to go. For Senna, she's focused on moving around quickly in battle and spacing, so Swifties are the most typical boot for her. And for champions that roam more like Pyke or Pantheon, both Swifties and Boots of Mobility can work well. Or if you find yourself in more elongated fights with Pantheon specifically, a defensive boot option could also work here. With tank supports, you're almost always going to be fine with building a tanky option, believe it or not. Against heavy magic damage teams or against opponents that have heavy CC normal abilities like Morgana or Veigar, you'll want to build Merc Dreads. Against heavy attack damage teams, you'll instead take Plated Steel Caps. Or again, if you're a champion that needs to get in range to engage or wants to roam a lot, let's say like Alistar, you could choose to take either Swifties or Mobility boots too. Mythics for poke, artillery, or AP supports are pretty straightforward. You're almost never going to buy Imperial Mandate, Rocket Belt, or Night Harvester. The majority of the time you will either get Ludens, Liandris, or Everfrost. You'll get Ludens against a team that is full of majority squishy champions, Liandris if you're against 2 or more bruiser or tanky champions, and Everfrost if your goal is to create picks with your champion like with Ahri support or some Swain support builds. Another reason to buy Liandris would be if you're against a strong healer champion like Soraka, Sona, or Vladimir. Purchasing a Liandris alongside an Oblivion Orb ensures that your healing cut lasts much longer on your targets. For enchanters, you also have 3 options in Imperial Mandate, Moonstone Renewer, and Shurelya's. You'll go Imperial Mandate nearly every time if the champion you're playing has multiple ways to easily proc it, such as Nami, whose Q, E, and R all have the ability to do so. For all other types of enchanters, you'll purchase Moonstone if you can tell by team comp, you're more than likely going to have long drawn out team fight. This normally happens when both teams have some beefy boys on them. If it doesn't look like you're going to have drawn out team fights where Moonstone can proc multiple times, or if your team is lacking engage or disengage, you should instead be building Shurelya's. Attack damage supports are special little sunflowers that typically have one item they all like to build most. With Senna, that's Eclipse. With Pike, he prefers Duskblade to help him stay safe while dunking on everyone. For Pantheon, he could really go either way depending on what's going on in the game. In elongated fights, you'd prefer to take Eclipse for survivability, but against squishier teams, Duskblade is preferable for him. And then finally we have Ashe support, who's the most special flower and builds Mandate since it works so well with her passive. With tank supports, you're going to have to choose between Locket of Iron Solari and Evenshroud. This decision is difficult for a lot of first-time tank supports. Locket is strong against heavy teamfight comps, AoE, burst, or champions that want resets on the enemy team to help keep your team alive. If none of those situations are true for the enemy team, then Evenshroud can be the item you build instead. Another thing with these two items that people tend to get incorrect is that you'd think if you're ahead, Evenshroud is the route to go because it will allow you to keep snowballing. But actually, the opposite is true. If your team is ahead, it's generally better to purchase Locket to help protect those shutdowns your team has more than likely earned. And if you're behind, then Evenshroud can regularly be a better call to help your team get the enemy shutdowns that they've likely earned. Flex items are going to be items you build based on the enemy team comp. For AP supports, you can look to build Morellonomicon against heavy healing teams, Zhonya's against teams with heavy burst, assassins or when you're being focused, a Dark Seal if you're winning lane early, that could eventually turn into a Magi's, or very rarely you could build a Banshee's Veil against heavy AP comps or opponents that have potent pick abilities like Ashe or Morgana. I think the most confusing item choice for AP players is when to purchase Horizon Focus or Shadowflame though. Yes, if the enemy team has a lot of shields or even if they get Mountain Soul, you should purchase Shadowflame, but what about every other situation? Shadowflame is better to build earlier and when teams have less magic resist. If the game has gone later, let's say past the 25-minute mark and the enemies have more magic resist, Horizon Focus is your better choice. The same debacle occurs when people are looking to build either Deathcap or Voidstaff. To say it quickly without diving super deep into the math, typically Voidstaff is better if your opponents have built at least one or two magic resistant items specifically. If the enemy team doesn't have multiple MR items, it's typically better to just build Deathcap if you have the cash for it. Same as our AP supports, you'll want to build a Grievous Wounds item for your Enchanter if against a heavy healing comp. Putrefire is one of the strongest Grievous Wounds items in the game and can arguably even be built first against healing champions like Soraka, Sona, or Yumi. If not against heavy healing team, you could instead look into building Mikhail's if against a problem pick champion like we talked about previously, such as Ashe or Morgana to help save yourself or other teammates who get caught. If neither of those conditions are true, the first flex item you should build will either be Ardent Censor or Staff of Flowing Water. Ardent Censor should be purchased with heavy AD teams or auto attack teams, and Staff of Flowing Water should be built with teams that have many AP champions on them. And finally, if you still have room in your build because none of those conditions we talked about are met, you could potentially round your build out with a Redemption. Redemption could be built earlier, but more value is typically derived from these other items. One of those situations where you could build Redemption early is a game where a lot of team fighting is happening, but typically as you get further and further on, those games will be fewer and farther between. For all attack damage supports, you're pretty much trolling if you don't buy Umbral Glaive at some point. This item is so efficient, so impactful, and so cheap that many AD supports will build this first. I even had to make a whole video about if it's actually OP or not. Regardless, while it's in the flex item category, build Umbral Glaive. AP champions wish they had an item similar to this. Past that, just like our other two classes against heavy healing teams, you could potentially build a Chempunk Chainsword if the enemy team is very healing heavy. We're talking like 2 or more champions with dedicated healing abilities. If not, AD champions typically function better with more damage items, so you should look to build things like Edge of Night if the enemy has some problem CC ability or abilities, Ghostblade if you're stomping to help you chase people down more easily, or potentially Death's Dance against heavy AD teams, or Maw Malmortius against heavy AP teams. Senna and Ashe are a bit different in their flex item choices, so go check out more of my videos on my channel to get more specific builds if you're going to choose them instead. For tank supports, once again, against a strong healing support or team, you'll want to rush a Thornmail, and actually rush for the full Thornmail, not just the Bramble Vest, since once you have the Thornmail, when you CC someone, you'll get the full effectiveness, as opposed to with Bramble Vest, Grievous Wounds only procs if you're attacked, and you can't control that. Most of the time for your second item, it will pretty much much always be either Zeke's Convergence or Knight's Vow. Zeke's works better against teams that have more attack damage, or if you're behind to help you net more kills with its damage. Or Knight's Vow works better to help protect your carry if you're ahead to help defend those bounties your team has earned. In more niche cases where you're doing well and against a strong attack speed champion, think someone like Vayne, Kog'Maw, Jax, building a Frozen Heart is another great option instead. And in even rarer cases when you're against a heavy magic damage team, Force of Nature is also a great option. There are some other specific champions like Maokai who do better with more movement speed, who like to build Dead Man's Plate for a defensive armor item instead. And while at one time Abyssal Mask would be a good magic resist item if you had multiple AP champions on your team, it's a bit more lackluster right now, so probably just stick to Force of Nature if you need MR. And if the game goes long enough, you should probably buy a Wardstone, but seriously, I'm a firm believer that your 6th slot for support should always be available for control wards. Wardstone gives you the ability to do that and increase how many wards you can have on the map at the same time, while also giving you health and ability haste. If you find yourself deep into the game, do not purchase any other 6th item aside from Wardstone. Some damage support players will be tempted to buy a 6th item that isn't Wardstone, especially if they're ahead. I'm here to tell you, drop your ego, stick to your role's job, and buy the goddamn Wardstone. That is all. Again, this isn't a one-size-fits-all. Some champions have more specific build paths than this, but in general, this should help you build correctly in different situations. If you guys found this helpful, please help me out by dropping a sub or a like on this video, and if you liked this video, you'll definitely like our last deep dive, which was why the heck blue side is better than red side, and why Riot isn't fixing it. See you guys next time. Peace.